Students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is Muckrakers, and here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab terms and take some notes. So in the last lesson, you learned about the Progressive Era, which was this period of widespread reform in America between about 1890 and 1920, or 1900 and 1920. And over the next few days, you're going to look at some methods that people used to make those changes happen. This is a fun time to study because we get to see people who worked in different ways to make America a better place. I admire many of the people that you're going to learn about in this video. The reformers that you're going to learn about today are all journalists that we call muckrakers. Muckrakers were progressive era reformers who used journalism to expose problems in society that many Americans were unaware of. These men and women wrote articles, they published books, they took photographs of problems that they witnessed, and they were all trying to shine a light on the problems in order to encourage change. The key word with muckrakers is journalism. Muckrakers, unlike other reformers that you're going to learn about, always use different forms of media to shine light on problems. I'm going to tell you about 5 different muckrakers, and I want you to pay close attention to what problem each one of them exposed and the form of journalism that each one used to expose that problem. So our first muckraker is named Jacob Riis, and Jacob Riis was a photographer who took pictures of the terrible living conditions of the urban poor. Riis went into dark, crowded tenements in New York City, specifically the tenements in Lower Manhattan, near what is now Chinatown, and he used a new invention called flash photography to take pictures of these places that were dark because they lacked sunlight. And he published his photographs in this book, How the Other Half Lives. The book was a bestseller, and it showed Americans that the tenements were really terrible places for the poor people who lived in them. Here is one of Riis's most famous pictures. This is in his book, How the Other Half Lives. And it shows the inside of a tenement in Lower Manhattan. You can see the darkness and how crowded this room is. So Riis showed that many poor people in America's cities were living like this. All right, the second muckraker is this woman, Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a black woman who wrote about lynching of African Americans. And lynching is when white mobs killed black victims, often after torturing them first, as a punishment for a crime that the black person allegedly committed. And the most commonly alleged crime was raping a white woman. But Ida B. Wells, by conducting research and gathering statistics on lynchings, showed that the black victims were innocent. And she concluded that whites used lynching as a sadistic tool to reinforce white supremacy. She wrote her findings in many newspaper editorials and published longer pamphlets like this one, which is called Southern Horrors: Lynch Law in All Its Phases. All right, the next muckraker is also named Ida, and this is Ida Tarbell. Do your best to distinguish between the two Idas who were both muckrakers. Ida Tarbell wrote about the problem of monopolies and corporate power, and specifically she wrote about the oil monopoly that was controlled by John D. Rockefeller, and his company was called Standard Oil. Tarbell did investigative research to expose the corruption and other illegal actions that Rockefeller had done in order to create his monopoly. And she published her findings in this book, The History of the Standard Oil Company. Her book is basically an account of all the shady things that Rockefeller did to get ahead in business. All right, before I go on, remember, there are two Idas, two muckrakers, One is Ida B. Wells. She is a black woman who wrote about lynching. And the other is Ida Tarbell, a white woman who wrote about the oil monopoly. The next muckraker is named Upton Sinclair, and he was a writer who focused on problems in the meatpacking industry. The meatpacking industry involved slaughtering cows and pigs and turning them into beef and pork for humans to eat. The work in the meatpacking factories was dangerous and bloody. This industry was concentrated in the city of Chicago, so Upton Sinclair went to Chicago and he went undercover. He pretended to be a poor factory worker so that he could get a job in one of the meatpacking factories. And then he described what he saw in the factory in a book that he wrote called The Jungle. The Jungle became a bestseller and caused outrage among millions of Americans who had been unaware of what was going on inside the factories where all their meat was made. All right, the last muckraker is named Louis Hine. Louis Hine, like Jacob Riis, took photographs, but Hine focused his camera on the problem of child labor. In 1904, a group of reformers formed the National Child Labor Committee, an organization dedicated to, quote, promoting the rights and well-being of children as they relate to work and working. And then in 1908, this committee paid Louis Hine to travel around America and photograph young children at work. And then they used his photos to fight for the passage of laws banning child labor. All right, it's time to review the objectives. I told you a lot of information. If you missed any of it, just rewind the video and look again. And I will see you in class. Bye, students.